I'm live. Yeah. I think it's still going live. Have to wait a little bit before it's actually sending the data. Yeah, and now I'm live on YouTube. We'll go live soon as well on Twitch. And today is an interesting session. I haven't streamed on coaches for the past 2 times, but this week I'm back. And today's session, as you probably already know, is on how to play the Caro-Kann. It's an opening that starts after 1e4. It's good to get things right at the start already. It's an opening for black that you can only play against 1e4. So against 1d4 or 1c4 or every other move you cannot really play it. And the thing is that the difference is mainly that the pawn on e4 controls the d5 square. So it's not so easy to put a pawn in the center. You have the Scandinavian, of course, starting with the move d5. But the thing is that after d5, white can take it. And after it takes, our queen is quite exposed. And we're not yet... we are not yet having a pawn in the center. So it's not that easy. So one thing that you want to do with black is put the pawn on c6 first and then to go d5. So it's a bit slow. It's not really a developing move, but the move c6 is the start of the Caro-Kann. It's a very similar opening to the French, which starts after the move e6, which also plans to, or the plan here as well is to put the pawn on d5, get a pawn in the center, and after, let's say, d4, d5, after e takes d5, you can now take back with the pawn, and you still have the pawn in the center. But there's of course a big difference between playing the move e6 or the move c6. And at first sight I have to say that it seems more logical to play the move e6, because the move e6 allows you to develop your bishop. The main advantage for playing one c6, however, is that with the pawn not being on e6, we're not blocking out our light square bishop. So the point of one c6 is basically to get a better version of the French. We were playing a bit slower than the French because we're a bit behind in development if we compare it, because our bishop is still not able to develop. However, in general we're quite solid, which makes up for it that we're a bit behind in development. Usually white responds to the move c6 with the move d4. These days actually the move knight f3 is also very trendy, and after d5 white wants to go knight c3, which is the two knights variation. We'll probably get to that variation later on, but let's first go for the main line, and also the move that to me makes the most sense. Black hasn't really done much in the center yet, and he has allowed white to grab the center with 2 center pawns, so it makes a lot of sense to put another pawn in the center. Our whole idea was to go d5, so that's the move we should be playing. And here there's a big question for white, because we are currently putting pressure on his e4 pawn. It's undefended. All of our pieces are still defended, especially our center pawns, so it's already white who's under a little bit of pressure, and he already has to make a very big decision. The main or the most logical move, I would say, to me is the move e5, because in general in chess you want to get space, and black's slightly passive setup has allowed white to gain space. But now we can see exactly why black would play the Caro-Kann instead of the French, and that is because now we can develop our bishop. Bishop to f5 is a nice move that we can play here, and we now want to go e6, and suddenly our bishop is outside of this pawn chain, whereas in the French very often it's inside the pawn chain, where it will be a bit passive. Usually when you have such a structure, you want to attack the center, so probably white will soon put his pawn on c3, and then he gets this pawn structure, and usually you want to attack it somewhere. And we cannot really attack e5 anymore with the move d6. We can still attack it with the move f6. But as we've gone d5, I would really not like to go f6 followed by fe5. For example, after the move knight f3, f6, let's say white develops. After takes, white has gotten a very, very nice square on e5 for the knight. And is doing quite well, of course. So we want to attack the pawn chain because white has a space advantage, but we should do this in another way. We should do this with the move c5. We should do this first with the move e6. After we move c5, white could take it. So we first go e6, allowing our bishop to develop to an active square, and also controlling the c5 square, so that we're able to go c5, and after d takes c5, we're able to capture it and have a nice development. After we've gone c5, if white takes, then the e5 pawn is going to be a bit weak. Also, we've traded off a flank pawn, a c pawn, for a center pawn, which is a very, very good trade, of course. And we should be quite happy when that happens. Black can also play a bit differently. You can also start with the move c5 instead of bishop f5. Bishop f5 is the main line, but c5 is definitely also a move. I faced it myself lots of times. I've played this e5 line from the white side loads and loads of times, and c5 is definitely a move that I've faced a lot. And the idea is to start with the pressure in the center very early on already. Usually it's not such a big deal if white takes, because you're able to go e6, and later on you're able to capture the pawn back, and otherwise you can, let's say white defends with the move bishop e3. We cannot really win back the pawn on c5 immediately, but we can, for example, play the move knight to d7, after which we're attacking both the e5 pawn and the c5 pawn, and we'll win either of them back with a healthy position. So c5 is also a move that you can play here. It makes sense for white to go c3, for example, defending the pawn chain, so that after c takes d4, white can go c takes d4 and still keep the pawn center. However, we do not want to release the tension in the center so early on. Instead, we would like to go knight e6, and this is actually a position that can arise from the French, with a full tempo up for black, with a pawn on e6. Because we have gone c6 and after that c5, so we are a bit slow if we compare it to that. But on the other hand, the main thing for black here is that we can still develop this bishop to a very active square. So we want to put pressure on the white center. Let's say white goes c3, we go knight c6, and white defends with knight f3, which makes a lot of sense, defending the e5 pawn, defending the d4 pawn. But now we can see already why we'd really like the bishop to be able to develop to an active square. Because after we move bishop to g4, there's a lot of pressure already on the white position. We have this pin, we're putting pressure on d4. Queen b6 is a move that is coming pretty soon to put pressure on b2, but also on d4 once more. So it's already quite clear that black's okay here. You could also consider first to take on d4 in this position. After c takes d4, you go bishop g4, and then to go queen b6, not to allow any d takes c5 options. But it's quite clear that black is doing quite alright. So even though we're spending a full tempo playing c6 c5, just not to have played e6 in this position, it's actually not so bad at all. We'll probably get to a bit more in the plans in these e5 positions, especially after bishop to f5. But I first want to cover a little bit more other options, and also at some point I'm gonna get into some model games. Also one very, very recent game, which was very enjoyable to watch. Maybe you've already seen it, but I'm probably gonna get over it pretty soon. So in this position you also have other options, of course. Instead of pushing the pawn, white can of course also take on d5, and white can of course also defend the pawn in some way. Even f3, which was not the game I wanted to go over, but this was actually played I think 2 days ago by Fabiano Caruana against Ferrugia in the Altibox Norway chess tournament. So it's definitely also a move that needs to be considered. Looks a bit stupid. I'm not sure how to put it, but it looks a bit stupid. But the main point is that black doesn't really have a good move except for taking probably. And after fe4, white still has his sender. So it's also definitely a move, but we'll get back to that later. Let's go first to move knight to c3, defending the e4 pawn. The idea is just to capture back on e4 after d takes e4 has happened. It's basically the same as the move knight to d2, because black will probably capture anyway on e4 and we transpose to the same position. There's one big difference. I was playing the move knight c3 in my younger days, and I thought it didn't matter where if you go to c3 or d2, but here you can already really spice up the game if you feel like it with black. My opponent in a game once went suddenly b5, and the main idea is basically to threaten b4 and afterwards win the pawn. And after you go e takes d5, you go b4, and you go either queen takes d5 or c takes d5 with a very interesting position. b5 is probably not objectively correct, but it's definitely an interesting way to immediately spice up the game. But let's go to d takes e4 because white could also just go knight d2 and avoid all b5 options altogether. So let's go to this line. And there were some very famous games in these lines, because this used to be the main line basically against the Caro-Kann. This used to be the main critical response for white. These days we have, I think, more shifted to the move e5 being the main response. But it used to definitely be the move knight to d2 and knight to c3 altogether basically, because we get this position anyway. And there are basically three main options in this position. One idea is to eventually put the knight on f6, and this can be done in two ways. One is knight to d7, with the idea of next to go knight to f6. After knight takes f6, you can then take back with the knight. So let's say knight to f3, knight to f6, knight takes. Next we can develop the bishop to either the f5 square or the g4 square, followed by e6, bishop out, and we have a fine position really. So white should treat this differently. But there are also two other options in this position. Recently there was also another game by Ferrugia in which he beat Duda in also the Norway chess tournament. There he went for the move bishop to f5, and basically just developing the bishop. Kicking away the knight. Knight goes to g3 mainly, getting a tempo on the bishop. Bishop drops back to g6, and it's nice that we really haven't gone 1e6 on the first move, because you can just see how wonderful this bishop is on g6. It's basically, there's basically no other square that's better for the bishop on the board right now than the square g6. So we have managed to get our bishop to g6, and the plan is to soon go to e6 and then develop the bishop and then get a healthy position. So what white mainly tries to do in this kind of position is usually it wants to trade off the light square bishops. The reason for that is just because this bishop is so wonderful on g6. White doesn't really want to do it immediately. He first wants to gain some space, so it goes h4, threatening to trap the bishop. Black usually responds with the move h6. Now white goes h5, bishop to h7, knight to f3, defending the d4 pawn. And the idea is now to go bishop to d3, because we have kind of won two tempi with white on the bishop, gaining some space on the king side, and then we want to trade down and finish our development with white. However, as black we should just continue our development. One thing you should be a bit careful of, by the way, is if white first starts with knight f3, I would advise you not to play e6, because this would allow the move knight to e5 with a tempo on the bishop. You really don't want to allow knight takes g6, because you're forced to take back with the f-pawn, which would really worsen your structure on the king side. Let's say knight to d7. You take on g6, f takes g6, and it's a complete mess on the king side. And also we've lost the bishop pair. So you have to drop back, but now can get a little bit nasty because there are gonna be some light squared weaknesses. So instead I would advise you to first play the move knight to d7, so that after knight to e5 you can just take it and enjoy a nice position. So, and this will probably transpose to the other lines where we have the bishop on h7. So you have to be a bit careful about this knight e5 idea, but it should be easy to deal with. So we get to this position. White trades down the bishops, and we haven't developed a single piece yet, but we are very solid with the pawns on e6 and c6. We want to go knight d7, bishop to d2, knight to f6. White usually castles queenside. It's a bit strange to castle kingside if you've overextended so much on the kingside with the pawn on h5, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to castle kingside. So white usually castles queenside. And now there's a big choice actually for black to make in this position, because we are still free to choose. It actually makes a lot of sense to castle either queenside or kingside, and it also depends on what kind of mood you are in. Because if you're castling to the kingside, you're castling to the opposite side of the queenside, and in chess that usually means that you're both gonna be attacking. It means probably that black is at some point going to start the attack on the queen side, and white at some point tries to go g4 to try and checkmate our king on the king side. So you can go either side, king side or queen side. It's both pretty reasonable. I would probably myself go for the king side castle because I like dynamic play and attacking play. So I would, in general, probably play the move bishop to e7. White gets the king a bit more to safety, getting it off the diagonal. Black castles. And now white usually plays knight e4, opening up the g-file so they can play g4 in the future. But one very important thing about the Caro-Kann, we've seen this before in the e5 position. Let me show it again. Is that very often we have a space disadvantage. So usually it's white who has more space, and when you have less space, as we have from the black side in the Caro-Kann, it means that we should be trying to trade the minor pieces. So we should be trying to trade the bishops and the knights to keep our queens and the rooks on the board, because it's a lot more easy to move with less pieces on the board, and especially if you have less space. So one general rule for the Caro-Kann, I think, is to try and trade light squared pieces. It's not in all positions, of course. You're not always gonna have a slight like a space disadvantage, but there are definitely some lines in which you do, and in those I would be trying to trade the pieces. So as we have seen in this line, it's in this line, it's a good thing for us that we have traded down the light squared bishop, because it's a minor piece that we have managed to trade. Next, white wants to open up the g-file, so he wants to move the knight away to an active square, but this allows another trade, and after takes, knight back to f6 with a tempo, queen to e2 and queen to d5. We have an active position. This is still a very theoretical position, but a position that should in general be fine for black, because we've already managed to exchange two minor pieces. At some point white is going to start the attack with g4, but on the other end we have counterplay in the center with the move c5, which is a very common breakthrough in the Caro-Kann, and one thing you should in general be aiming for. So there's play for both sides, and in general very interesting position. Then let's go back to the other plan which we had in the position. You can also go for the queenside castle. You can play the move queen to c7. White, I think, usually plays the move king to b1. Black castles queenside, I mean, c4. And in this position you can just develop, not develop, but try to go for the breakthrough. I think objectively speaking this is supposed to be a little bit better for white. It's nothing much, but it's supposed to be a little bit better for white. and which is why most people go for the kingside castle. But if you like more solid positions, less dynamic positions, I would try to advise you to go for the queenside castle, because it's definitely more safe if both kings are on the queen side, because it means that it's going to be very difficult to attack for either side, because if white starts marching with the pawns, his own king is going to be weak. So it's a bit of a more safe option to go queenside castle. And I think this is one of the main variations of the Caro-Kann, because this is a very very common position on move 4 after knight takes e4. And one of the main options, I think the main line actually, is bishop to f5. These days, however, people have started to play the move knight to f6 actually immediately. Knight d7 used to be also a move, but it's not that much into fashion anymore. But these days, people started to go knight f6, knight takes f6, and e takes f6. And followed by very easy development, we can go bishop to d6, castles, and enjoy a nice position. I'll show a game, a very recent game from this position a bit later on in the stream. In general, it's a very, very interesting position. We have the double pawns, which seems like we have a worse structure with black, but the upside is that our king is going to be very, very safe on the king side, because we have so many pawns around our king. So it's going to be very easy to defend it. And meanwhile, we have some very easy development, because we have a nice open diagonal for this bishop, we have a nice open diagonal for this bishop, and a lot of central squares where our pieces can go to. So let's read a question from chat. Shivant is asking, what do you think about e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, takes, bishop f5, and knight to e2? Yeah, to be honest, I don't know that line so well from the Caro-Kann. Actually, Caro-Kann is one of the openings that I want to adopt into my own repertoire, so this is still a line that I have to look at from the black side. I think this might have actually been a game from Peter Svidler against Anish Giri. I remember that game because Anish Giri was in a must-win and he played the Caro-Kann with black. I think the game went something like knight to f6, knight to f4, and then the move e5, opening up the center and basically equalizing the game. Because after takes, you have the move queen to a5 check with a double attack on the king on e1 and the pawn on e5. You'll take it back with a very symmetrical structure and a balanced position. So I think the way to deal with this move is by playing knight to f6, followed by striking the center with e5. But let's go to another line that I wanted to cover, the move knight to d7. Let's go for the first. Let's first cover some more variations before I go into the model games. I was a bit too excited already to show some games already, but let's cover some more options. So far we've mainly had the move e5, and we have had the move knight to d2 and knight to c3. To be honest, there are not too many more options in this position. One option is the move f3, which was recently played by Caruana. I would in general take, and then strike the center with the move e5. Definitely a move to remember. We just saw it in the previous position. The main point is that we're threatening to win the pawn on d4. On d4. And it seems like at first we were giving a pawn away. In general, I wouldn't care so much because white now has a doubled isolated pawn in the center, which is very, very bad in general. So it's not really like we lost a pawn. We completely ruined white's pawn structure. But also because we have the move queen h4 check, which is incredibly difficult to answer because g3 loses on the spot due to queen e4 with a double attack, winning the game. So white has to move either king e2 or king d2, but it's incredibly bad, of course, for white. So instead, white plays the move knight to f3, and we pin the knight with a move bishop to g4. We can take the pawn, but white actually doesn't take back on d4. White goes bishop c4, followed by castles, and this is actually very similar to the king's gambit. There's just a lot of pressure on the f-file on f7 especially. and this could be very, very dangerous for black. So instead I would go bishop to g4. Again, de5 is not very relevant, to be honest. We can just go knight to d7 and soon finish our development. The pawn structure is just too bad on e4, e5. So instead we go, white should go bishop to c4, going for the kingside castle. But I think that after the moves knight to d7, defending the pawn, castles, knight f6, blocking the f-file, c3, oh, not takes, sorry for that, and bishop d6 instead. No, didn't want to do that. Black has a very solid position. White has the center, but we've developed all of our minor piece already, and there is actually a lot of pressure also on the white center here, and that is not that easy to deal with. We're ready to castle in the next move, and in general we have a solid position. So we're doing actually quite alright, and it's a very fine position. So it's actually not so difficult to deal with this move f3, I would say. So let's go to another option, which is actually quite a big option. I think about 2 years ago, 3 years ago maybe, this move e takes d5 got very popular again. There used to be the move c4, which was very popular, which very often leads to this kind of position with an isolated pawn for white. However, I'd first play knight f6, knight to c3, and then knight to c6. Not taking on c4 just yet. We want to first develop our bishop, go e6, and we should have a fine position. There's more theory connected to this, but it's not a very relevant variation. Not too many people go for this. It's not very dangerous. It's very playable always for black. So I will not go for this too deeply into this. But people have started to play the move bishop to d3. And basically they're just going for the Carlsbad structure. So the Carlsbad structure is when you have the center pawns d4, d5, and either white or black has a c pawn and the other side has an e pawn. So a slight change in the structure. It's not symmetrical, it's actually a bit different. And white's main plan is just to put this bishop on f4 and get both bishops on their most active diagonals. The point is behind the move bishop to d3 is actually to also prevent the move bishop to f5. So in general, typical advice I would give you in this kind of position is that once you're able to develop this bishop, this light square bishop to an active square, either g4 or f5, you should be fine. So a move that I would recommend in this position is playing knight f6, trying to develop the bishop to g4. And here I would recommend you to actually have a look at the most recent games in the Altibox Norway chess tournament. There's one game going on right now actually, which is Ariantari with white against Aronian, in which Ariantari went h3 and Aronian went to move g6. He's not allowed to develop the bishop to g4 anymore, so he wants to go to f5. White usually responds with knight to f3, and then we go bishop to f5. And it seems a bit ugly if you're not very used to this concept, but this structure is actually very fine for black. It opens up the g file for play along the king side. We get a very, very nice square that's very difficult to deal with for white, especially now that he's gone h3. It's very difficult to kick out the knight with f3 because he's weakening the dark square so much. So it's good to know that this structure with g takes f5 is very fine for black usually. And I was listening to Kramnik's commentary today on Chess4's stream, and one thing he was explaining quite well was that usually this structure is especially fine for black once white has gone h3. The main point being that black at some point wants to start going rook to g8 and starts to attack on the g file. White usually wants to deal with this by at some point playing the move g3, but with the pawn already being on h3, this pawn on g3 is very loose. So if, let's say, at some point white castles kingside, let's say black goes rook to g8, white castles queenside, kingside. At some point where you see happening is queen c7, e6, bishop to d6, knight to e4, and sacrifices happening on g3. Because white has weakened it so much by going h3. So this structure is especially fine for black once white has gone h3. But in general it should be also okay with the pawn on h2. So this move g6 is a nice move, trying to develop the bishop to f5. Earlier on in the tournament there was also a game Aryan Tari against Alireza Firouzja. In that game Aryan went c3. And Alireza responded to this with bishop to g4, developing the bishop to an active square. At some point the bishop might drop back to h5, g6. And as I said before, as long as you get out the bishop out, you should be doing quite alright. So here as well, black is probably fine, and I would recommend you to have a look at that game, because it was a very nice game by Firouzja. I'm not going to cover it in this stream, I have limited time in this stream. But it's also a game I would recommend you to have a look at. In general, I would advise you to follow top chess, especially now that it started again after it has been gone for a couple of months. And there were actually quite a lot of Caro-Kann games in the top tournaments, so Caro-Kann is still an opening that's very much being played on the highest level. But this covers this ED5 line a little bit. But let's have a look actually into some model games. It's not only from the black side. White might also win, but it's just to show a couple of ideas for both sides. You also in general want to know, of course, what your opponent is doing. So it's also good to have a look at games in which black lost to know how it can go wrong and try and avoid that with black. In this game white went knight c3, d takes e4, knight takes, and black went knight to d7. And the game I was gonna have a look at was actually a very famous game because it was Deep Blue, the engine, in the year 1997, in which it beat Garry Kasparov. It's a very famous game, so it's definitely part of the history of the Caro-Kann, so I had to show it today, of course. And actually the critical response in this position is the move knight to g5. It seems a bit strange to develop the knight once more, but the point is that there are some tricks in the position for white. One being, for example, after the move h6, white has the move knight to e6, attacking the queen, and after pawn to e6 you have queen h5 followed by checkmating black because the king is nowhere to go. So there are some tricks connected to knight to e6 in these lines, which is part of the reason why this line is not played anymore. Or not, okay, it's played of course, but it's not played as much anymore, especially on the top level. So black continues with the development, knight to f6. White also continues, bishop to d3. Again, now that the h5 square has been covered, knight e6 followed by queen h5 is not possible anymore. But in this current position, if you play the move h6, white again has knight to e6, because you cannot take it because of bishop g6 checkmate. So definitely watch your light squares if you play this line with black. So instead you should go e6, so that you always have the e7 square for the king. The blue went knight f3 in this game. Very logical move, sometimes intending to go knight to e5. And surprisingly enough, Kasparov went h6 in this position. I'm not sure again what the reason was for this. I think back in the days they underestimated this deep blue engine. They thought it would probably go back to e4, and black definitely has a fine position here because white has wasted two moves playing knight to g5 and knight to e4, so black would be completely fine, of course. However, deep blue went for the most critical move, move that I actually have gone for myself once in a game. Knight takes e6, sacrificing the piece, and it's actually very, very dangerous for black because after f takes e6, bishop to g6 happened, king to e7, and you can, for example, castle and the king is very loose in the center, and you have to be very careful with black. Instead, I would definitely recommend you to play bishop to d6, a move that we'll go to soon. The idea is not to weaken your light squares with the move h6. You're almost ready to castle. You're also ready to play h6 now, because the king now has 2 nice squares to get to e7 and f8, so the king is definitely safe right now. And now you're able to play h6 on the next move. However, in this game, Kasparov went for the move h6, knight takes e6, pawn takes e6. Kasparov went queen e7 instead of pawn takes e6, because pawn takes e6 is just very, very dangerous. And it seems like you're gonna lose the piece and not even have the king in the center. However, white can castle. And the problem for black is that after queen takes e6, rook e1, you're losing the queen due to the pin. So you cannot take back with the queen, which means that you have to take back with the pawn anyway. And the whole idea of this queen to e7 move is to actually clear the d8 square for your king. So after check, you have king to d8. However, the king is still in the center. White has only 1 pawn for the piece, but you can just see how passive the position is for black. He's not able to develop the bishops, he's not able to develop the rooks. The king is on a very bad square. Cannot really go to c7 because you'll get hit by a check. And the knights are not having many great squares either. So deep blue went bishop to f4. b5 happened. Gary wanted to get in bishop to b7, create some squares for the king, because right now it literally has no square to go to, so it's quite close to getting mated actually. a4 happened, opening up the a file. Bishop to b7, rook to e1, improving the position once more. Knight to d5, bishop to g3, also creating some ideas of bishop h4 for the pin. King to c8, 8 takes b5, opening up the a file. And now queen to d3, attacking the b5 pawn. And you can still see how passive this position is for black. The rooks are still not doing anything, the bishop is still not developed. The queen is very weird on e7, and the king is just so bad on c8. Gary protected the b5 pawn with the move bishop to c6. But now deep blue struck and played the move bishop to f5, winning the e6 pawn basically. You cannot really defend it anymore, so you have to go e takes f5, sacrificing the queen. But after rook takes e7, bishop takes e7, c4, Kasparov actually resigned the game in 19 moves, because after b takes c4, queen takes c4, he's gonna lose the bishop. You cannot defend it by king b7 because you're getting checkmated in 1. So you're gonna lose the bishop on c4, c6. You can still protect it by rook knight to b4, but it's clear that a lot of things have gone terribly wrong. For example, rook to e1, and the position is really uncoordinated, and at some point you're gonna lose this position. So after 90 moves, Gary actually resigned the game. So we're gonna have a look now how black should actually play this. If you want to play this in the game, you should of course go bishop to d6 in this position, as I've already said, developing your pieces to an active square, and basically you're able to castle next. At some point you want to grab some space, also opening up the position a little bit with either c5 or e5. So first finish development, then open up the center, and then you should be doing quite fine. The setup from the white has also looks a bit strange with this knight on g5. So it definitely does make sense that black at some point is going to be fine if white has gone knight to g5 and will soon go back to e4. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Instead, okay, so white will play queen to e2, developing the queen. And the point is that after h6, knight to e4, knight takes e4. Remember that we should be trading pieces. We have a little bit less space, so we should be trading minor pieces. So definitely do take the knight. Queen takes e4, knight to f6, and I wanted to have a look at another game, a very famous game as well. Actually, I think the main Caro-Kann player that has existed throughout the chess history so far, and also probably the person who really popularized the opening again, is Karpov, the former world champion. And this was a game by him. It was Kamsky with white against Karpov. White played the move queen to h4. And now Karpov came up with a novelty. I actually had a look into the database a bit. Yeah, eccentric horse. I was actually thought the same. That the reason why Kasparov didn't go for the or did go for the move h6 is indeed because he underestimated the engine deep blue. He thought he wouldn't be able to find the move knight to g5 and then knight takes e6. He thought the engine wouldn't be that strong, so he did go for wait, sorry for this. But he did go for the sacrifice just because he thought the engine would be able to find it. So bishop to d6 happened instead. Queen to e2, h6, knight to e4, takes, knight f6, queen h4. And now Karpov came up with a novelty in this position. If you're viewing the stream, try to find the move for black here. You may already know it. It's a very difficult move actually to find. So either you probably know it or you're gonna have a difficult time to actually find it. But maybe try to find some time. Let me give a hint first. It's connected to the queen on h4 being quite close to being trapped actually. It doesn't have, it only has the h3 square actually available because all these squares are actually covered by pieces. So it's quite connected to the queen not having a lot of great squares, and try to find the best move in this position. No, so eccentric, the main point is actually that g5 is not possible yet because it's pinned. After bishop takes g5, white is completely winning because after h takes g5, you can take the rook on h8, winning decisive material, and white will be opening pawn and an exchange. But it has to do with this g5 idea, so definitely do keep this idea in mind when trying to find the correct move. Yeah, so rook g8 could be considered, but the problem is, as you pointed out yourself, let's say white plays a random move, that after actually g5 right now wins. Wait, sorry. But yeah, the main rook g8 is also a move to consider because actually it's not so bad to even sacrifice the h6 pawn. There's actually a different move that I'm looking for, but rook g8 is already in the right direction. It's not the move I was looking for though. Eccentric Horse asks, do you prefer the Caro-Kann over the Sicilian or the French? In general, in my life, I've played loads and loads of Sicilians. So, in general, I'm more of a Sicilian player than a Caro-Kann player. But as I said before today, I'm trying to adopt the Caro-Kann into my repertoire. So, it was also good today to do some research myself for this stream. I have some experience, of course, mainly from the white side. But yeah, I have to say I mainly play the Sicilian myself. So the move to play in this position is actually the move king to e7. It's a very, very strange move. It's very, very difficult to find. So it's not so strange that a world champion had this as a novelty. That actual world champion was the first to ever play this move. The main point being that right now you're protecting your rook on h8, and that makes you ready to go g5. And it's actually very difficult for white to find a move that saves the queen, because let's say you play some random move like bishop to d2, which is way too slow. Now g5 comes, queen h3 is the only move, and either e5 could be strong or g4 could be strong. G4 being the simplest, of course, because it's just a double attack. You're gonna win a piece. So actually you're putting a lot of pressure on your opponent here by playing the move king to e7. Because you're threatening g5, but it's actually very difficult to do anything about it. So the move that I think is the most logical for white here is to play the move knight to e5. Because if g5 now, you have this g3 square, or even h3 because g4 is not an option anymore because it's not with a double attack. So you can also go to g3 and you save the queen. However, the point was that after knight to e5, Karpov took the knight, pawn takes e5 and went queen a5 check with a double attack on the king and the pawn, which means that he's gonna win the pawn next. c3 happened, queen takes e5, bishop to e3, and Karpov is up a pawn. Actually, the king is not so bad on e7, it's actually quite safe. It has a lot of shelter where it can hide behind, and the rook is about to go to d8. So, yeah, Karpov is just up a pawn right now. White obviously has some slight compensation also because he has the bishop pair, but it's clear that Karpov is doing quite alright. b6 happened, trying to develop the bishop to b7, where it's probably its most active square. Queenside castle happened, g5, a very interesting move by Karpov. Rook, queen to a4, c5, rook to e1, and this is one of the main reasons why I will be playing the Caro-Kann, is because it's so solid for black. The king is in the middle of the center. White has developed every single piece to a very active square, and still our king is safe on e7. It just has an incredibly nice shelter for its king to hide, and yeah, throughout the game the king was actually surprisingly safe on e7. Karpov kept on developing. He got his queen back to get it to safety. Bishop d4 could be played because the c-pawn is pinned by the queen on a3. Bishop to e8, rook to d5, and rook to d8. And oh, sorry, I didn't intend on doing that. And eventually in this game, Karpov managed to convert his extra pawn. White has some compensation, but not enough for the lost pawn. So black is doing better here, and eventually managed to convert this position into a full point against Kamsky. And it's just an incredible concept to see for the first time, this move king to e7. I actually once had a classical game in this position. I played the move queen to h4, so I was white in the game, and me and my opponent were both not at all aware of this move king to e7. But after the game ended, someone pointed it out to us that this was a famous game by Karpov in which he went king e7, and I was completely shocked when I first saw it. It was a very nice move to see, and I probably would have been in a lot of trouble if my opponent hadn't known about this move. Now I wanted to get into a more recent game. We had two kind of old games already, but I wanted to get into a very new game actually, which featured in another line. We've so far seen 2 games with the move knight to d7, but I wanted to have a look at the recent game between Duda and Magnus Carlsen. This was the game Magnus actually lost, so it's a game in which black lost the game. But it showed very nice ideas for black in this position, which they got after knight takes f6, e takes f6, because it's just in general a very nice structure, or a very interesting structure mainly for both sides. White has its trumps, he has basically a better pawn structure, but on the other end, it's questionable how bad this pawn structure actually is for black, because it's very solid and very easy to play for black. And it's also not so easy to realize this extra pawn for white, because it takes so much time to create a passed pawn on the queen side, especially with so many pieces on the board. It's quite difficult to make like a passed pawn. So I think here maybe, for example, a pawn endgame is something that you should be trying to avoid with black. So in general, try to avoid endgames probably. because then the extra pawn on the queen side might count. It's not so easy to create a pass pawn on the king side because of the double pawns. So try to avoid the endgames probably. Usually in these positions, white wants to play bishop to d3, so it makes sense to go c3 first to defend d4, because after bishop to d3 we can simply take the pawn. So c3 happened, bishop to d6, developing the bishop to an active square. Bishop to d3 castles, queen to c2, targeting the h7 pawn. Black goes rook to e8 check, knight to e2. And this is actually a very interesting position, and try to find the best move in this position for black. It's a move that took a long while to come up also for black. It's actually a very, very recent trend, which actually kind of revives this whole knight f6, knight takes f6, e takes f6 line, because we didn't really know that this was such a good move for black in this position. So try to find the best move in this position. It's not mainly about theory eccentric, it's mainly to give some ideas. It's quite difficult to say how many lines, and no, the king e7 move is not called the delayed bone cloud. But it's not about remembering theory, it's mainly about remembering the ideas, remembering that you should be trying to exchange minor pieces. At some point you want to go for the breakthrough with c5, maybe sometimes e5, but mainly you go for the breakthrough with c5. And try to remember some of the lines, of course, because you need some knowledge also in the opening. But mainly it's about the ideas. But the very, very strong move in this position is actually h5. It's a very strange move. You have your king on g8, so in general you don't really want to overextend too much. But there is actually a problem here right now for black. You cannot play f5 because you take the pawn. And bishop takes h7 is a real threat that white has. And it seems like you can just play either h6 or g6. But you're gonna have to have a look at what white's plan are in these positions. There's the main problem behind this move g6 is that you're gonna simply get hit by h4, followed by h5, and at some point white is gonna castle queenside, and he has a devastating attack on the king side. So it's really not a great position for black to have. So g6 should definitely be avoided. Then you have the more solid move h6, but the problem is that you've weakened your light squares actually a lot. And after the move castles, followed by the move knight to g3, so let's say you go knight to d7, which seems like a normal developing move, knight to g3, you have weakened your light squares quite a lot on the king side, and white should have an edge here. And I think in general you should try to avoid this kind of position with black. So that's when they started to come up with the move h5. Because now if white simply castles kingside, which seems like the most safe option, then we go h4 with black. And the pawn may seem a bit weak, but it's basically, it's very, very difficult to attack for white, so it's not really weak even. It prevents the knight to come to g3. It's very difficult for white to play on the king side, so mainly white is probably going to go at some point bishop e3, rook to e1, but first should probably go h3 to prevent black from playing h3, so it should go h3. Now I would just go knight to d7, which is a very typical plan. Let's say white goes bishop to d2, then to go knight to f8, getting the knight to the king side to get a defender for the king. And now I would try to go bishop to c7, queen to d6, trying to grab some, get some mating ideas. And a very typical trick actually for this kind of position is, let's say white goes a4, you go bishop to c7, let's say white plays some random move like rook d1, queen to d6, and sometimes after bishop f4, not sure if it works in this position, but you have the move rook takes e2, getting rid of the defender of the bishop on f4. So after queen takes e2, queen f4, you're simply winning because you've won 2 pieces against the rook, which should be a good trade. And you're also still checkmating on h2. So instead, black should probably take on d6, but now after rook takes c2, bishop takes c7, rook takes b2, you've won a pawn. So this is actually a typical trick connected to this mating idea. And definitely want to remember if you want to play these positions. However, it's more critical, let's say, to go for the queenside castle. Black has kind of opened up his position a bit on the king side, so it's more critical to go for the queenside castle. So bishop e3 is a more typical move. Knight to d7 again, castles, and at some point it's clear that white is gonna start to create an attack on the king side. It's not so easy yet for black. For white, it's not so easy yet. But it's at some point gonna happen. So black should try to create some play on the king side, queen side as well, trying to get some mating attack on the king as well. And in general, black is also trying to follow a light square strategy. White has weakened the light squares a bit, and this bishop is soon gonna appear on e6, putting pressure on all these light squares. So it makes a lot of sense to play b5. And the idea is basically, let's say white plays some random move, to go knight to b6 next, then get bishop e6 in, and grab the control over all these light squares. Maybe some a5, maybe even a4, grabbing even more light square control. But it's clear what your strategy is with black. Also some b4 breaks might be happening. But then you have a very nice control in general of the queen side here. So instead, Duda went for a very concrete move. He went d5. And the idea is basically that after c takes d5, you can go bishop takes b5, and the structure has been ruined on the king and queen side. So instead, Carlsen goes to the pawn sacrifice, move to c5. And this is also something which you should not try to remember by heart, but it's just to show how things can be played in these positions. And it was a very interesting game in general. Duda kind of has to take the pawn, otherwise his previous move didn't make sense. But this was a pawn sacrifice. Carlsen doesn't really mind to give up the b pawn because it does open up the b file. So his next move made a lot of sense. But it wasn't the most accurate move. It was a bit more accurate to go a6. But it's a bit of a difficult move to make. And another move was also incredibly interesting for white in this for black in this position, which was the move rook takes e3, f takes e3, and then simply to go knight e5. And it's a very difficult concept to get. You've already sacrificed the pawn, now you're also sacrificing the exchange. But you just have a very, very nice dark square control. And at some point you'll get the attack rolling. Some rook b8, maybe g6, bishop f5. Bishop might appear at some point on e5. Maybe some c4, knight d3 ideas might appear. So a very interesting concept. But not one you have to go for. You can avoid it, of course. Carlsen went rook b8, c4 happened, a6, bishop f4, and Carlsen wanted to unpin the knight on d7 so he can go knight b6 or knight e5, so he went rook e7. Knight g3 happened, trying to go knight f5, so Carlsen stops this by going knight to e5, controlling the f5 square, attacking c4 also. Knight e4 happened, now rook to b7. This was also 1 point behind the move rook e7 to get to the 7th rank, so you can go to b7 double on the b file. Duda went b3 to protect the b2 pawn. Rook b4. And the main idea of rook b4 was to sacrifice the exchange. But it's already quite clear how dynamic and interesting such a position is, because there are lots of dynamical positions, possibilities happening for both sides, and very, very interesting way to play. Bishop d2 happened, and the main idea was to sacrifice the exchange in this way this time, and then go bishop f5 with very, very good compensation for the exchange. Carlsen lost this game. This was the end of his 125th non-losing streak, which was a pity for Carlsen, of course. But at this point, he had a very fine position. Yeah, eccentric. I'm a 25-year-old Dutch international master. If you want to know more about me, you can perhaps Google me, of course. I also have my own stream on Twitch, on Xamax2000, which is my usual username. But let's continue with the lesson. rook to e1 happened, and here Carlsen kind of missed his chance. He should have gone knight to g4, trying to make use of this pin, threatening knight takes f2, which would be devastating. So you kind of have to defend the pawn. And here you could go bishop e5 with black, with a very, very fine position actually. Rook b2 is about to happen. Oh, sorry, I wanted to draw arrows. Knight h2 is a big threat. This pin is incredibly annoying. Some queen b6 might be an interesting move. So a lot of ideas for black in the position. Not sure why Carlsen didn't go for this move, but it's quite clear that black has very, very good composition for the sacrifice material. Instead, he played h4, but this was a bit too slow. This was too much in the style of AlphaZero probably. h3 happened. Knight to g6. He wanted to go for this setup, but it was a bit too slow. Bishop e5, knight to f4. Duda went rook e3, knight f4, and then g4. Not a great move. I think it was better to go g3 to kick out the knight from f4, because now with g4, bishop g6, he still manages to keep the pin. King d1 happened, and Carlsen wanted to open up the position in some way, but he probably should have waited a little bit. He should have gone queen to d7, f3, and then bishop to e5, controlling the position and continuing the attack in a more slow way than he did. Here he could have very much fought on in the game. Instead, he went for the move f5, g takes f5, knight takes d6 first, sorry, queen takes d6, g f5, and after bishop h5, f3, Carlsen didn't have enough compensation for the sacrifice material, because the bishop has been exchanged, the pin has been gone, and he's done a bit too much material right now. After the move queen f6, Duda set up a very nice trap, which was bishop to c3, queen to g5, queen to e4, and it seems like Carlsen has the combination queen to g2, attacking the rook, rook to e1, only move to save the rook, and now queen to a2, threatening to checkmate. But Carlsen missed a move, which was queen to c2, and the main thing he missed was that after queen takes e4, rook to e8, he cannot take, because if he did, king h7 is forced, and now rook h8 was a very, very sneaky trap, I mean, that Duda already went for on move 29 when he went bishop to c3. So something very, very sneaky done by Duda, but very well played by Duda, of course, to set up such a nice trap for the world champion, and managed to beat him. In the game, after rook e8, Carlsen was forced to go king h7, but he lost another rook, and now he's down a rook and a piece, which is way too much material. So he didn't manage to save this game. He lost his 125 non-losing game streak, and yeah, that was at some point the end of the game. The game continued for more 30 moves, but there was nothing to be done about the result. And very, very interesting game. I hope I showed a lot of ideas of the Caro-Kann. There are still definitely more ideas to be covered, but I showed a little bit of the lines that can be played. In general, very interesting lines, very different structures also. It can lead to a lot of different structures. And also, in the general rules I would try to copy are try to exchange minor pieces when you have space disadvantage, which you very often have. Try to get your bishop outside of the pawn chain, your light squared bishop, I mean. So for example here, try to get it outside, then go e6 later on, and then go c5. Yeah, in general, c5 is also a breakthrough that you want to go for in the future. So those are more the general rules. I hope that you enjoyed today's stream. And yeah, I am allowed to show Carlsen's losses on this stream. Yeah, you can also, GR Magnus, you can also start with c5. Yeah, it's in general just a different line. I've mentioned this line also before. I've once myself played d takes c5 here, for example. It's just a line. Bishop f5 is a developing move, while c5 puts immediate pressure on the center. Both moves can be considered. Both are probably fine for black. So it's more a matter of taste than one is better than the other, basically. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed today's stream. I'll be probably back next week for a different topic. And yeah, hope to see you